Hello, welcome to the channel. My name is JonHut, and today I want to share with you how to properly set up your hardware synth on FL Studio. Now, my recommendation is that after you watch this video and you learn how to properly set up your hardware synth, then you create your own template. So every time that you start a new session or project, you always have your synth ready. If you want to know how to create your own template, or if you want to download for free a basic but powerful template, then I'm gonna leave a link of the video on the description below. And with that said, let's start with this tutorial. Okay, so the first thing that I'm gonna show you is how to connect your hardware synth into FL Studio in terms of audio. Now, the accessories that we need are a single instrument cable if your synth is mono, or two different instrument cables if your synth is stereo, and last, an audio interface or a mixer. For this tutorial, I'm going to use Sequential Pro 3 as a hardware synth and Universal Audio Volt 476 as an audio interface, which have 4 different analog inputs. So I already have the output of my synth connected to the inputs 3 and 4 of my audio interface. So the next thing that I have to do is go to the options and click on audio settings. And here on audio settings, I'm going to select my audio interface. Now remember that if you are a Windows user, in order to record external audio, you have to select ASIO for all. Now here on the playlist, I'm gonna create a group with 2 different tracks, one for audio and another for MIDI. In order to do that, I'm simply gonna go to a free track, right click on it and rename color and icon. And now I'm gonna select the next following 2 empty tracks, right click on it and group with above track. Now I'm gonna select the first track on this group, right click on it, and I'm gonna go to track mode. And now on track mode, I'm gonna go to audio track and select the next empty track. In this case, the insert 24. Now I'm gonna right click again on it and I'm gonna put the name of my synth and I'm gonna select as an icon the jack plug. So now if I open the mixer, I can see that the insert 24 is assigned to this track on the playlist. So now with the insert 24 selected, I'm gonna go to the audio input source, left click on it, and in here, as you can see, I have 2 different groups. The first one, which is for stereo inputs, and the next one for mono inputs. Now in this case, as my synth is stereo, I'm gonna select the line 3 and 4 as my stereo input. So now if I press a key on my synth, you can see that I'm getting audio into this insert. Okay, so we are almost ready to start recording, but let me show you just one more thing. Now let's imagine that I start adding effects into these empty slots. I tweak a little bit this EQ. I also tweak the pan and the volume fader. By default, FL Studio is not gonna record all of these effects and settings. And that's because on the left side of the input source, if I click on it, I have some record and monitor options. So as you can see, it's set to external input only. Now, if you wanna record effects, then you have to select the post effects. If you want to record the EQ, you have to select post EQ. If you want to record the volume fader and the panning, you have to select post level and panning. And if you want to record everything, you have to select post track. And for monitoring external input, we have these 3 different options. If I click off, basically I cannot monitor what I'm playing from my synth. If I select when ARM, I can monitor what I'm playing on the synth only when this track is ARM. And if I select on, it doesn't matter if the track is ARM or disarm. I can always monitor whatever I'm playing from the synth. For this example, I'm gonna leave everything as it is. And another thing that I want to mention is the reason why I assign this track from the playlist to the insert on the mixer. So basically, all of these options that I show you, like the input source, recorded with effects, EQ or panning and volume, and also arm or disarm the track, I can easily do it from the playlist without the mixer with these little options that I have in here. So that's the reason why I highly recommend you to assign this track from the playlist to an insert on the mixer. So now let's record the Hardware Synth into FL Studio. And as a tip, I recommend you to always leave one bar before you start recording and also 1 or 2 bars after you finish your recording in order to be sure that also the tail of your song is being recorded. So now I just simply have to go to the record button, left click on it and select audio into the playlist as an audio clip. And this is how you record your Hardware Synth into FL Studio. So now let's have a look to the Midi setup. Okay, so the way how our Hardware Synth communicate with FL Studio or your favorite DAW is via Midi. And in order to connect our Hardware Synth to FL Studio, we have basically 2 options. You can either use the traditional 5-pin Midi cable, or as most modern synth, you can connect your Hardware Synth via USB to your computer. And the advantage of using USB is that USB is bidirectional, so you only need one cable. As if you want to use a traditional 5-pin Midi cable, you need 2 different cables, one for a Midi in and another for a Midi out. Now, another thing to consider is that if you use a traditional 5-pin Midi cable, the computers doesn't have this type of port. So you have to be sure that at least your audio interface have this type of Midi ports. Otherwise, you are not going to be able to connect your Hardware Synth using this type of cables. In my case, I have connected the Sequential Pro 3 to my computer via USB. So now I just have to go to Options and select Midi Settings. Now here on Midi Settings, as you can see, I have a Pro 3 on inputs and on outputs. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the input, enable the Pro 3, and I'm gonna select a free port. You can choose whatever you want, just be sure that it doesn't match with your other different devices. So in this case, I'm gonna select the port number 3. And now I'm gonna go to the output, select the Pro 3, and I'm gonna select the port number 3. You also have the Send Master Sync option, which I recommend you to leave it off. If you want to use the arpeggiator or sequencer of your synth, then you can activate these options. But for this tutorial, I'm going to leave it off. Now we are going to go to our Hardware Synth and set up correctly the MIDI options, which normally are on the global options or your Hardware Synth. Now, on the global options, you are going to have different options in terms of MIDI, like the MIDI channel, MIDI clock mode, MIDI clock cable in and out, etc. So depending of your setup, these options might be different for you. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to keep it simple. So the first thing that you are going to modify if needs is the MIDI channel. For MIDI channels, you have from 0 to 16 channels. You can choose one in between all of these channels, or you can leave it on all, which basically all of the channels are gonna work on it. And that's how I have it on my synth. The next option that you might change is the MIDI parameter send and receive. The easiest one is CC. And the last option that you might change is the MIDI in or MIDI out cable. So if you are using USB, be sure to select USB. And if you are using the traditional 5-pin MIDI cable, then be sure to select MIDI cable. And once you have all of these settings on your Hardware Synth set up correctly, the next step is going to be to add a MIDI out plugin. So I'm going to open the channel rack, I'm going to go to the plus button, and here on MIDI, I'm going to add a MIDI out, which is basically the plugin that we are going to use to control our Hardware Synth. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to select the same port as we did on the MIDI settings. And if you select on your Hardware Synth a specific channel, then you can change it from this little box in here. Remember that you have from 1 till 16 different channels on each port. As mine is set up on all, it doesn't matter which channel I select. Okay, so now that I have the MIDI out plugin, I'm gonna do the same as I did with the audio. So I'm gonna go to the playlist, and here on the second empty track that I have on my synth group, I'm gonna right click on it, I'm gonna go to track mode, and this time I'm gonna go to instrument track. Now I'm gonna go to use existing channel, and I'm gonna select MIDI out. And now I'm simply gonna rename it. Now, this step, same as for the audio, is optional. The only advantage of assigning this track is that from the playlist, if I go to this track and I double click on it, I have a quick access to the Midi out plugin. So I create a new pattern where I add some Midi notes into the Midi out instrument, creating a basic bass line. So let me press play and let's have a listen to it. So now, in order to record these Midi notes into audio is exactly the same process as we saw with the audio. I just have to be sure that the audio track of my synth is being armed. Go to the record button, left click on it, select audio into the playlist, and that's it. Okay, so now that we have the Midi out plugin set up, let me clarify something. So here on options, if I go to Midi settings, as I mentioned before, we have the output and input section. Now you have to understand that the output section is not the output of your hardware synth, same as the input section. Basically, this is the Midi output section of FL Studio and the Midi input section of FL Studio, which means that if you want to send Midi notes or control your hardware synth with FL Studio, you have to set up the output section. If you enable the input section, as mentioned before, now your hardware synth is basically a Midi keyboard. So let me give you an example. Here on the channel rack, if I select the synth and I press a key, you can hear that I'm receiving the audio from the synth. But now, if I select another instrument or sample and I press the key, you can hear that I'm receiving the audio and at the same time I'm playing the instrument of the sample that I have selected on the channel rack. Now there is different ways to fix this issue. The first one is that if you don't want to use your hardware synth as a keyboard, simply go to options, Midi setting, select your hardware synth and then disable the input of your hardware synth. And if you want to use it as a Midi keyboard, then enable it. And now here on the channel rack, if you only want to receive Midi notes from your hardware synth to your Midi out plugin, then select the Midi out plugin, right click on it and go to receive notes from. Now in here, select your hardware synth and here you have the 16 different channels. As I mentioned before, mine is set to all channels. If you have selected a specific channel, then simply select the channels that you have selected. In my case, I'm going to select all. So now if I select a different instrument or sample and I press a key from my hardware synth, I'm only going to receive the Midi notes to the Midi out plugin, independently of which instrument or sample I have selected. Okay, so now let's have a look of how we can control our synth using the Midi out plugin. So here on the Midi out plugin, we have 8 different pages with 9 different knobs where we can use it to control our hardware synth. So in order to control our hardware synth, I just have to go to this configure button next to each knob. So left click on it and in here you can name it as you want. In this case, I'm going to control the cutoff filter. Next, we need to add the controller number. In order to find out all of the controller numbers of your synth, you have to check the manual, which normally is one of the last pages. So this is the manual of the Sequential Pro 3. So if I go to the bottom, in here I have the list of all of the CC controllers. In this case, I want to control the filter cutoff, which is the CC33. So now back on the Midi out plugin, I'm going to select the controller 33. And now I'm simply gonna go to accept. So now I can control the filter of my synth using the Midi out plugin. So let's have a listen to it. So now if I go to presets, in here you can see that I already have one for the Sequential Pro 3. So in here, I divided all of these pages by sections: the filter, oscillator, mixer, amp, and LFOs. So I can control the main parameters of my hardware synth with the Midi out plugin. Now, one common problem that you might have is that if you start tweaking all of these knobs, like the cutoff, the envelope amount, etc., when you change the preset on your hardware synth, then all of these parameters are gonna be locked even on your hardware synth. And you might not understand the reason of that. So what I recommend you to do is to reset all of these parameters and deactivate all. Now, you know that all of the parameters are deactivated because when you touch a parameter and is active, the name of the parameter is going to be an orange. And if I deactivate all of the parameters, the names are going to be in gray. So my recommendation is that you only touch this parameter when you exactly know what you want to do and when you are almost ready to record. Otherwise, by touching all of these parameters and changing a preset from your hardware synth, it might be a mess. So always remember to deactivate all of the parameters. Now, one of the advantages of controlling your hardware synth with the Midi out plugin, it might be to create an automation, but that's not all. Let's imagine that your hardware synth only have one LFO. If you use Midi out plugin to control a specific parameters, you can have as many LFOs as you want. Now, another important thing to consider is that your LFOs might not have the option to synchronize with a VPM. Like for example, on my synth Sequential Rep 2, which you cannot synchronize the LFO. So last, let me show you an example of how can you automate these parameters. So first of all, I'm gonna activate the cutoff and the filter envelope amount. Now I'm gonna go to the mixer, and on the Pro 3 channels, I'm gonna add a pretty peak controller. I'm going to select a sawtooth and set on 3 steps. Now I'm going to go back to the Pro 3. I'm going to right click into the filter envelope amount and I'm going to go to link to controllers. Now in here on internal controller, I'm going to select the pretty peak controller of the Pro 3 and I'm going to choose the LFO and I'm going to press accept. And now I'm going to go back into the mixer, and now with the peak controller, I'm going to set the base of the LFO and the modulation. So as you can see, now the pretty peak controller is modulating the filter envelope amount. And last, I'm going to go to the filter cutoff, right click on it and create an automation. So now here on the playlist, I have the automation to control the filter cutoff. And now if I want to bounce this MIDI into audio, I'm just going to left click on record button and select audio into the playlist as an audio clip. Okay, so the last thing that I want to show you is that using MIDI is exactly the same as with the audio. We might have latency problems. So I'm going to show you a quick tip of how to fix a latency problem using MIDI. Okay, now I'm going to add into the Hardware Synth channel an oscilloscope. In this case, I'm going to use Schultz Audio Oscillos Mega Scope. Now I'm going to go into the kick drum and I'm going to add the same plugin, Schultz Audio Oscillos Mega Scope. Now I'm going to go into the master, and here on the master I have another Oscillos Mega Scope. And now I'm going to solo the kick drum and my hardware synth. So let me press play and let's have a listen to it. So now if I zoom to one of these shots, I can see that the audio from the hardware synth is not aligned to my kick drum. So starting from the kick drum and I right click on the grid till the beginning of the audio of my synth, I can see on the screen that I have 27.4 milliseconds of latency. So now I'm going to go to the mixer, I'm going to go to the hardware synth track, and in here I have an input latency. So I'm going to click on it and I'm going to go to set in milliseconds. And in here I'm going to put 27.4. So now let me zoom back and let me press play and let's have a listen to it. Now we can see that the audio from the hardware synth is perfectly aligned to the kick drum, which means that we don't have any more latency issue. Okay, that's all for me. Hope you like and learned something from this video. If you have any question, please leave a comment below. Thank you very much for watching. My name is JonHut.